Greetings, I am Tom Earl. On this week's episode, we talk banned immigration enforcement in the time of Trump with Shoba Sivaprasad Wadhia. Check it out. Woo! Greetings, I am Tom Earl, and this is my year of adventure. We know you could be anywhere, so the fact that you are here today sharing your greatest gifts, your time and energy means the world to me. I hope you know that in this moment, you are valued, you are appreciated, and you are loved just as you are. As you can see, I am not alone. I have an amazing guest. She goes by the name of Professor Shoba Sivaprasad Wadhia. How's it going today?
It's going well, thank you.
Wonderful. Do you mind if I introduce you to the good folks out there via reading your phenomenal bio?
Sure.
Professor Shoba Sivaprasad Wadhia is the Samuel Weiss Faculty Scholar and Clinic Professor of Law at Penn State Law and University Park. Her research focuses on the role of prosecutorial discretion in immigration law and the intersections of race, national security, and immigration. She has published more than 30 law review articles, book chapters, and essays on immigration law. Wadhia's first book, Beyond Deportation, The Role of Prosecutorial Discretion in Immigration Cases, was published by New York University Press in 2015 and named an honorable mention for the Eric Hoffer Book Award. Her second book, Banned Immigration Enforcement in the Time of Trump, was released on September 10th, 2019 by New York University Press. Her immigration textbook, Immigration and Nationality Law, Problems and Solutions, with co-authors Steve Yale Lawyer and Lenny Benson, will be published by Carolina Academic Press in 2019. In 2018, Wadhia was named the inaugural editor-in-chief of the American Immigration Lawyers Association Law Journal, a partnership between AILA and Fastcase. In 2019, she served as the Enland Scholar in Residence at DePaul University School of Law. At Penn State Law, Professor Wadhia teaches doctrinal courses in immigration and asylum and refugee law. She's also the founder-director of the Center for Immigration's Rights Clinic. Wow. You're doing a lot of powerful and amazing things in the world. Thank you so much for the service that you're doing.
Oh, thank you. It's a busy time.
Yes, I can imagine. We always like to start the interviews by sharing this, that it's as much as the awesomeness as our bios can capture, they don't ever really give us the full insight into somebody as if we were to hang out with them. So our first prompt that we always start with is, if you really knew me, you'd know that.
That I love being a mom.
Oh, that's wonderful. Congratulations. Depending upon when this interview comes out, my wife and I will be having our first child in the next couple of weeks. So
congratulations.
Thank you. So before we jump into, the heart of what you're doing, did you always know growing up, I wanted to be a lawyer and a professor and to focus on immigration? Was that always something you knew?
Well, yes and no. I think it depends on how far back we go. For a long time, I wanted to be a piano player, and so music was really the first passion of mine. And when I got into middle school, I really became taken with what I was reading and the roles that judges and lawyers had in responding to social issues and issues of inequality. So I'd say maybe 7th or 8th grade, I came home and told my parents I want to be a civil rights lawyer. And how that evolved into immigration, that came a lot later. But I think that was something inside of me from a very young age.
How did you then find that your specialty or your area of focus was going to be immigration?
So it was a little bit of an accident. I was in law school, and I don't tell immigration or law students generally that they have to know what field they want to go into. by the time they're a first or a second year law student. But for me, that's how it happened. I took immigration law, and it really spoke to me intellectually. The law itself has been compared second in complication to the US tax code. So it is a pretty complex statute, but it was something that I saw as a puzzle. I enjoyed reading the sections and comparing and cross-referencing sections. And it also paired nicely with my desire to work with people and to at least help one group that I think is a marginalized group in this country reach a level playing field with everyone else.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that background. For some background on our audience, we've had, in terms of people who might share a similar field as you, Hassan Shibli from the Council on American Islamic Relations. He's a dear friend of mine. So he's come on a couple times to talk specifically upon the Muslim ban rulings. But otherwise, could you give us a little bit of maybe background information on some of the terms you're using in your book, like discretion and prosecutorial law, discretion, and how it relates to your book Banned?
Sure. And there's a lot of terminology in immigration, and it feels like an alphabet soup, even for the lawyers who are in the field. Discretion, if I were to define it simply, is a choice. You could think about it even outside of the law. I'm using my discretion to tell your future child that they have to have milk with their breakfast every morning, because that is an authority you have, at least for a period, to make a choice. And in law, it plays a really powerful role, and immigration is no exception. So in the immigration space, there are about 11 million people living in the United States without authorization or without papers. So if you pair that with the reality that the government has very limited resources to deport maybe 400,000 or less than 4% of that number, choices have to be made about who you're going to target for enforcement and removal and who you're going to place on the back burner. So we see discretion play a really powerful role. You can see why, if I'm an American taxpayer, I personally believe that I want my government spending its very limited resources on people who pose a true threat or danger to the security of the United States. I don't want my government spending their money on busboys at a restaurant downtown who may have kids that go to the same school as my own.
So when you're saying that I want my tax dollars to go towards, deporting people who are a true danger and threat to our country, how have you seen the Trump administration interpreting what a true danger and threat is?
So I think, one chapter in my book is called Everyone is a Priority. And the way you get to choosing who your high priorities are and who your low priorities are is by having priorities in the first place. So under the Obama administration, when President Obama announced DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, he was really making a choice that people who have DACA-like qualities, like someone who's come to the U.S. at a young age, in school or graduated, without a serious criminal history, are low priorities. That was a choice that the president was making on how he would use or ask Department of Homeland Security officers to use their discretion. Contrast that to the Trump administration, where we do have a priority list, but it's a much broader one. And it includes priorities that are so broad that anyone could be a target. In fact, one quote, and there are several stories in the book Banned, because one thing I did was interview former government officials people affected by immigration enforcement, as well as attorneys on the ground. And, one quote or story that an advocate told me was how everyone is a priority in the Trump administration, how it doesn't matter if you've lived in the United States for 20 years, if you're on your way to Sunday school, if you have no criminal history, you're still a priority. And that's consistent with what the former Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE head, Tom Homan, said in public. He said, no one is off the table, right? If you're here illegally, we are looking for you. And so that is a very dangerous message in my view, because it sends a message that no matter who you are, you're a priority.
And what about that is dangerous?
So it means that the person who's lived here for 20 years and is on their way to Sunday school is vulnerable to immigration enforcement. So I think it's dangerous on a human level because it creates a lot of fear, and very legitimate fear, in communities where someone might be undocumented. And that should not be a surprise when we think about how many people are living in the US without authorization, and how long ago it was that Congress, in fact, acted to make any changes or updates to our immigration law or our lines. I also think it's dangerous to the rule of law, because what happens when you don't use discretion, or use discretion in a fair way, is that you end up with a very dysfunctional system. So, you really can't have a rule of law without having a healthy use of discretion and a fair use of discretion. My own position, and it's something that I write about, not just inside the law, but outside the law too, is that if you are going to use discretion, discretion should be used generally to favor the non-citizen or the immigrant. It shouldn't be used in a way that weaponizes or makes people more vulnerable than they already are. And so when you look at our system today, we have a lot of people who feel vulnerable to immigration enforcement. We don't have a clear set of priorities. And so you end up in a situation of haphazard enforcement where everyone is a priority.
So this might just be where perception comes into play, because it doesn't seem like to me that everyone is in play. Like, I know people who are white and English, they're here undocumented. Yeah. People who are white and Canadian undocumented, they don't seem to have the same kind of fear as my Muslim friends or my friends who are from Central or South America. Am I just perceiving this wrong, or does it seem that there is more of a targeting of kind of the groups that I named?
Sure. So I, in this book band, did not write the chapter on priorities or generally along whether these policies are discriminatory or discriminate along lines of race or religion. I do have a separate chapter on the Muslim ban, and some of the people that I interviewed did, in fact, I think that the Muslim ban is an example of a policy that very explicitly targets people based on where they're from and their religion. I would also say that if we were to take a step back, it's the perception is reality, and that many of the people who are affected by immigration policies in the time of Trump are brown and Black people. So, if you walk into an immigration jail, I've spent considerable time in jails where immigrants are detained, both pre-Trump and this administration. You're not going to see a jail that is full of Europeans. What's interesting about that question, though, is if you do end up with a European family or an individual in immigration jail, that could result in more of a media blitz. And so that could, in fact, have the silver lining, if there is to be one, of exposure to an issue that would, usually not get the same kind of exposure. So I saw this happen somewhat recently in Berks County Residential Center. This is right here in Pennsylvania, where I'm situated in central Pennsylvania. We actually are home to one of 3 family detention centers in the country. 2 are in Texas and 1 is in Pennsylvania. And when there was a European family that was sent to family detention, that not only got news coverage here in the United States, but it also got news coverage in Europe, and really opens people's eyes to the issue of family detention and the traumatizing effects of babies and toddlers being jailed by immigration.
You know, with that example and any of the other interviews that you were able to draw upon for your book, and maybe this wasn't something you concluded, but what did you start to see as the message from the Trump administration of who is American and what America should look like?
That's a great big picture question, right? What kind of America do I want to live in? What kind of America do I want to leave behind for my children and future generations? And when I read the book or look at how immigration has played out in the first half of the Trump administration, it does not look like the America I want to leave behind. And so I really end with a final chapter where I talk about solutions and recommendations for, what it means to be a democracy and to maintain our, value as a nation of immigrants. And I think it's hard to even be in this field without some optimism. And being in this field for the last 20 years, I also have a better picture of the past and what it meant to have, for example, bipartisan proposals by Congress on the table for what immigration should look like, and uses of discretion by presidents that were fair and humane. And so if I think we look at just what the administration should be doing, one thing that has really tarnished what America looks like is the use of discretion by this administration. And in fact, almost every, if not every policy that I mention in the book, the choice to issue or enact Muslim bans, 3, in fact, the choice to shrink refugee numbers to the lowest in the history of the Refugee Act, or since 1980, the choice to separate parents from their children at the border and beyond, the choice to detain families together. These are just 4 examples, all major policy choices, all discretionary choices.
If you don't mind me just changing direction for just a moment,
Sure.
How do you approach writing a book like this or this work as a lawyer rather than, and I know they might blend, but rather than if my primary, profession is activism or journalism? How does a lawyer approach writing a book or drawing conclusions like this?
So I think that's a great question. I think it's one leg of the stool that I think makes up this book. And I think it also gives the book a legitimacy and richness that it would otherwise lack without having deep knowledge of the law and how it's applied. And I spend a lot of time taking very complicated legal topics in immigration and boiling it down into accessible information and information that can be understood by my clients or by the public. And so what I've tried to do with Band is to take the human stories that I'm listening to and with people I interviewed, and to really pair that with the knowledge that I have as an immigration lawyer, sitting with the immigration code for hours upon hours, teaching the subject in a classroom so that there is a there to the stories. I think it also gives some credence to the recommendations, because in my view, these are not solutions that are out of reach or elusive, but in fact, solutions that are within the domain and possibility of an administration or a Congress to make in the future. So, I mean, I'll just give as an example the chapter on the Muslim ban, and in fact, I have this conversation at the beginning. You know, there's been a lot of controversy around what to call these bans. Not everyone will call it a Muslim ban. Some people call it a travel ban. I think it's inaccurate to call it a travel ban, because this does not just include people who aren't able to come to the United States for a weekend in Disney World, right? That's what we think of when we think of travel. These are, in fact, would-be green card holders who are not able to be here for no other reason than where they come from. And there's nothing in the law that blocks that. So there's also a way to criticize policies that, in my view, violate the law. And the Muslim ban is one example of that. But also, as somebody who has read every single line of each executive order and the presidential proclamation and every single court decision that's been made, and as one who has filed lawsuits challenging these bans, I think that gives me a somewhat unique lens to actually talk about the stories too, because I am able to really take the needle and thread and stitch together a position and a story and a narrative that has the kinds of details that some readers will be very hungry for, but also has the soul of the story by including the stories and the people who are actually affected.
You know, just a personal question of interest that I have is I so admire and envy that discipline to be able to read every line that you that you said, because I have found in my later years that's something that I don't have. Where for you brings the inspiration or the passion, or what kind of allows you or drives you to have that discipline and that analytical skill? What do you think is behind that for you?
So, you know, I think a lot of what I do isn't too special, right? We all have trades that require discipline. And so, and we all got that from something or some life experience. You know, for me, discipline generally came from music. So I go back to music. You know, I practiced 4 hours a day, starting in about 6th or 7th grade. And I woke up early in the morning. And I didn't have that discipline because I was getting something material in the end. And I didn't have that discipline because I was trying to put something on a resume, but I really wanted to make music beautiful, right? And it was a tedious type of discipline too, because you might spend 2 hours on 2 measures of music. So law or reading executive orders, especially sloppily written ones, is not that different, right? Where I do a lot of this work early in the morning, and I have a gain or an end goal, but it's not material. It's not necessarily in my job description or 4 corners of it either. But it's with the goal to have enough knowledge of the information so I can help others like understand what it actually says, what the message is. And then as a lawyer, how am I going to use the information I have to explain what's happening to clients and families? Now, this may be less than obvious, and that is some of these policies affect immigrants in central Pennsylvania in pretty dramatic ways. We think about the impact of immigration policy maybe more stereotypically at the border, for example. But where I teach at Penn State, we're a large college campus, and we have people who live in our community who have DACA, or who are in DACA families. We were the fourth most affected university in the country by the first Muslim ban. So the number of students and scholars we have from every banned country is pretty significant. And one of the pictures in the book includes a town hall, and we do a number of town halls and community forums, again, to educate our community about changing immigration policy. And the first forum we had on the Muslim ban drew almost 300 people on a Friday afternoon. So that really, and in rural Pennsylvania. So that just gives you a sense for not only how hungry people are to have accurate information, but also the reach of these policies throughout the United States.
In explaining these complex policies to non-lawyers, to non-law students, to people affected by these policies, what are some maybe new ways of explaining it that you found in writing this book that the average person was able to grasp and feel empowered in that knowledge?
Yeah, so I think it's still an observation in progress, right? Because the book itself is only a couple of months old. I do think the storytelling helps ease some of the legal explanations or analyses. I think I have, even before this book, a natural tendency to not talk in overly technical terms when I'm trying to explain immigration law to people. And that might include students who are learning law for the first time, or to a public or the municipality. In fact, I run a clinic here at the law school, and so we represent a wide range of clients. The police department is a client of ours. When we train police officers on immigration, we're not necessarily going to use high-level legalese to explain terms in immigration. I think it's important to know your audience and to know, how is the audience that I'm speaking to going to resonate or connect with a particular issue. So if I tell a police officer that they may not be trained or even understand whether somebody is without a status, I might use the example of a student, an international student who takes something other than the full course load without permission in a given semester is considered to be failing to maintain their status, or to be maybe without immigration status. How is a police officer going to know from someone walking down the street whether they are maintaining their student status, or if they're even an international student? So I also tried to think about how I would explain this to a classroom. Maybe it's middle school. Maybe it's a fifth grade classroom. So I think how people think about systems or fairness or who belongs or who should be let out, these are questions that you could ask on a much broader level and then bring down to immigration. And then I might finally end this question by, confessing that prior to being an academic, I was a lobbyist. So I spent many years as an advocate in Washington, D.C. And so I used to be in the situation of having to take multi-hundred-page bills, for example, and boiling it down into simple text for the field, or to explain a specific area of law and why it should be changed legislatively to a congressional staff member or to a member of Congress. And so it taught me to explain complex information in simple terms, not because the issue is simple, not because a person that I am delivering it to is simple, but because that is a way to open up a dialogue and to enhance understanding.
I'm guessing, and I may be making an incorrect assumption, that a lot of the questions at the town hall and, examples in the book come from people who are attempting to apply right now for naturalization. Is did you find any gems or advice or new ways of explaining things to people who are in that process right now during the Trump administration?
Well, in terms of the interviews for the book, at least for the affected people, I mean, actually with all of the interviews, I did most of the listening. So it was a somewhat of a different posture than a town hall where people might be asking me or members of my clinic questions, and then we're answering and delivering information. They were really the ones to give me a lot of insight and information. You know, I'm always struck when I interview dreamers or people with DACA or people who have been here but are in a vulnerable or temporary status like TPS or temporary protected status, first how resilient they are. So that was a sort of common thread I found in interviewing DACA holders and similar people who are similarly situated. Also, just the psychological warfare. So there's a quote in the book from someone that this was not just one person's comment of not just the policy changes themselves, but this psychological warfare that policy changes have on someone's well-being. So, you know, the fact that the president can pick up the phone and send out a tweet, and then you spend the whole day deciphering it. This is sort of how it was explained to me by one person with DACA. And you think, how bad is it? How bad isn't it? And then that is a change that is followed by a number of really bad actors. So that was just one common theme that I heard. And I'm always paying attention to the psychological dimension of the immigration policies on affected communities. Even though I am by no means a mental health specialist, I'm paying attention to that dimension at all times. I guess another illuminating piece that I found was in interviewing former government officials, people who were in positions of power, either with the Department of Homeland Security or with the former Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS. That's the agency that used to exist before the Department of Homeland Security. It's the agency that I first started practicing immigration law before. And I was struck by how alarmed most of the former government officials were by current policies, that we are not in an era of business as usual. One former INS official told me, you know, that the way in which U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, this is the arm of the Department of Homeland Security that processes green cards, applications for citizenship, applications for asylum, that it was historically viewed as an agency that handles benefits, that is the customer service agency of the immigration mammoth. And she analogized that history to the current state of affairs, where she said, today you can walk into a naturalization interview and walk out with handcuffs. That would have never happened in the INS days. And so that was a line that really stuck with me, because it also gets back to this everyone is a priority, that it's also who is carrying out the enforcement has really changed. And it has really extended to the arms of the government that we haven't traditionally viewed as an enforcement arm.
How are they making new policies that would have that happen? You think in a naturalization interview, you're at the final hurdle only to be handcuffed and deported. What is the new laws, or how are they using discretion to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that nearly every, if not every single policy that I cover in the book, including this example I just shared with you, have anything to do with the change in law by Congress or in the immigration statute that I mentioned earlier as being so complicated, nor are any of these policy changes legal requirements. And that's where you have to really question the moral arc or the fairness behind how discretion is being used. So in the case of someone walking out in handcuffs, that could include the allowance of ICE to be in a USCIS office and to be present and able and willing to handcuff someone in the middle of a naturalization interview and take them into ICE custody. And that is something that we've seen happen in more than one instance, and in the view of this former INS head, would have never happened in INS days. She went on to say, and that's because, that's not how we did business, right? That wasn't the culture of the agency, and the view of INS at the time, at least the services side, is that we were there to look at benefits, not to, involve ourselves in enforcement or extend that tool to someone else during a benefits interview.
Kind of looking at it from the other angle. So how did you see, or did you get any insights into how the Trump administration is taking their values, their worldview, and then bringing in a team of lawyers to then enact it as policy? Did you get any insight into the process of how they're doing that?
So, I think the greater insight I received, especially from former government officials, was the lack of process and the lack of consultation before a decision is made. So one different former government official that I spoke to, who had a very long tenure, more than a decade, more than 2 decades, in fact, talked about how executive orders have really been increased in frequency during the Trump administration, at least with immigration. I can't speak for other areas of law. And he said, the fact that a president would go for executive order as a tool over something like rulemaking is a new way of doing business and not a better way. And the reason he said that is because with an executive order, you can put together and sign an executive order that becomes legally binding with very little input from other people. Contrast that to a regulation that is published in the Federal Register with the notice and comment period, where the public is providing input. One of the deepest criticisms with the first Muslim ban is that it was enacted immediately on January 27th, 2017. Even CBP officers at the airports who were responsible for implementing the ban had no guidance about what to do. And it was later revealed that even the White House's own lawyers were not consulted before this ban was enacted. So I think we've seen little process. In terms of the role of lawyers, that would be an interesting observation. I did not talk to existing government or White House lawyers as to how they're advising the president. I won't make the presumption that none of them have expertise on immigration. I mean, the former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was a longstanding member of the Senate and was well known as having the most anti-immigrant position in the U.S. Senate before he was tapped to be the Attorney General for the Department of Justice. So even if there are lawyers involved in the process, I can make the assumption that these are lawyers that don't have a position that is pro-immigrant, nor do they have a narrative that is consistent or anywhere near consistent into what kind of America I want to leave behind for my children.
You said a phrase earlier. You said this is clearly not business as usual. So I do get people who listen to my interviews specifically because they want to troll me for talking about these kind of things. Uh-huh. And they're going to hear that and say, exactly, that's why we voted for Trump, because he's not business as usual, and they're thinking, this is all good stuff, get these people out of here. Why should they care? What, when they read your book or hear us talking, why should they not feel like these are all good things? You're highlighting good things. What is it, your message for them or conclusions for them?
So my business as usual point is really about the power of discretion and how discretion is being used. I think every American, including Trump supporters, should be deeply concerned about how discretion is used, because if it is not used in a healthy way, it really undermines the rule of law. Look, I'm a law professor. I got into this field because I loved the immigration statute. There's nothing more rule of law like than someone who likes to read statutes and then see how they're applied. So this isn't about the rule of law versus something else. This is about understanding how discretion functions and how you can't have a rule of law without discretion. In terms of people who are happy with what's happening in the Trump administration, I think it's going to take a while to change hearts and minds. So I'm in rural Pennsylvania. I talk to a lot of different people of different political views, and I will tell you that one way to affect, maybe not change, hearts and minds is to be clear and to educate and to make sure that how we talk about immigration law and policy is not polarizing, but is connective, right? And it might be connecting because of a story. Maybe, one way that immigration resonates with someone who may not have cared for the issue before is because they have a neighbor or they have a friend who's affected by immigration. And now all of a sudden they have a curiosity about how the system works. If that alone is not sort of a play, I think another piece that we should care about is the economic piece, because many of the immigration policies are being carried out and funded by the American taxpayer. So let me use immigration detention as one example. It's one of the largest growing forms of mass incarceration in this country. It costs about $140 per day to house one immigrant. And right now we have about 50,000 immigrants in detention on any given day. It costs about $300 to detain a family. So just from an economic point of view, I want to know how limited resources are being used and whether they are being used in a way that I find to be humane. One reason why family separation, for example, had such a broad outcry, an outcry that went way broader than people who care about immigrants or people who care about immigration, is people couldn't bear to see a 2-year-old being separated from a parent at a border. And we now know that the government actually had no real way of tracking them. I don't personally think it should take that in order for the American public to care. But we know that the extremity of some of the policies and the way discretion is being used in this administration have been so extreme that they have really extended, in my view, the number of people who do care and who are curious to know more.
So while you're listening, I'm practicing, being centered in the moment and concentrating, because so many of my fears keep coming up and apprehensions and worst case scenarios. Earlier in the interview, though, you talked about that you still are feeling optimistic, that there are solutions. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit. Why you have the most knowledge out of anybody I know, and you are still optimistic? Could you share how come?
Well, so part of my optimism doesn't come from the law, right? Part of my optimism just comes from humanity. And, we all have a story, and I have too many to count, of moments of shared humanity I've had throughout my life. And I think ultimately, that is where people are going to care about a humane policy. So we have a Refugee Act because people come to the United States and they are afraid to return, or they have fled a country where their own country will not protect them. Right? And most people can't imagine that. But when people hear a story of someone fleeing a country whose government will not protect them, that does create a certain amount of compassion that I think that all of us have. So I think shared humanity is one reason why I think I have optimism. I also think that the Trump administration is by definition going to be short-lived, right? And so when we look at the trajectory, or we look backwards, we're talking about one term or maybe 2 terms. I think that a lot has already been done. People say the damage is done. I don't disagree with that. And I certainly, have a commentary about that when it comes to the courts. The courts give me optimism, but they're also not the ones who are going to save us. The courts have been so critical in providing a short stopgap to policies that reach executive overreach. But ultimately, the solution is going to lie with a new way of thinking by the executive branch around discretion, as well as long-term solutions by Congress. So the third reason I have optimism is we live in the United States of America. And, I have been to other countries and taught students from all over the world who are stunned that you can even talk about President Trump the way we can here in America. Because if they were to do the same thing in their home country, they would be punished. And we live in a system where there is free expression, where there are checks and balances, where courts are an important check to the executive branch, because no president is above the law. Every country in the world is not like that. And so if you value the system we have in this country, and you value the rule of law and the way that it works, I think that we have to leave this era with optimism, with cautionary optimism. We also have to make sure that this history is documented. And so that's one real goal I have in writing this book too. I don't want someone sometime in the future saying this never happened, right? Or suggesting that, these policies that a future generation may find inhumane may not have ever happened. Because they have, and they're now part of our history. And that's something that we all have to live with. And find out what our role and responsibility is now and in the future around.
I love that. So for someone who's listening right now and they've already gone and ordered the book, and now they want to tell one of their friends to get the book, how would you suggest that they explain what the book is about to their friends?
That's a great question. So, and the book it just came out on Audible, so now there's every format you can think of. So one way is to say, if you ever wanted to have the immigration policy under Trump demystified and told with clarity and with a human face, this is a good book to read. It's not information that's dumbed down, but it's told in an accessible way. Another way that you might talk about this book to a friend, I have most of my family, I'm a first generation lawyer. No one in my family is a lawyer. No one else is in this field. Is true stories, right? So I might use one example or one story in the book. Hey, mom, have you heard of DACA? It involves, let me tell you the story of one person who's affected by it. And, in the state that you live in, did you know that there are 10,000 people who live in the state that you live in with DACA? And this affects people all over the state. So I might try to localize or humanize one policy or one issue, and then encourage reading of that book, of the book.
Yes, I love that. Is it your voice for the Audible?
It is not. In fact, I learned that my book was Audible a little bit by surprise. So it is not my voice, but the storytelling is done very well and very articulately.
Kind of off that, we have a whole bunch of entrepreneurs who are also at the intersection of activism. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got published with such an awesome publishing company, and anything on that as an author?
So, I feel like this also was an accident and a stroke of luck. So one thing is, anything that I've written, even as an academic, I feel very fortunate in that I don't know that I ever wrote a law review where I said, oh my gosh, I'm a law professor. I think I need to start writing law reviews. What am I going to write about? Right? So I came into academia and I knew that the very first thing that I wanted to write about was prosecutorial discretion. And the reason was based on the cases I worked on as an attorney. And then I turned to the literature, and there was nothing written since the 70s on the topic. And incidentally, the story was about the old Beatle, John Lennon, who was fighting deportation and who needed prosecutorial discretion during his deportation case. So fast forward to the Obama administration, I had amassed a body of work around deferred action, prosecutorial discretion. I had enough people telling me that may not be a good trajectory as a scholar. Maybe you write one piece on it and it may not have a long shelf life or trajectory, but it turns out that it became the only game in town during the Obama administration, and prosecutorial discretion and deferred action became, common terms, at least in the immigration discourse. And so my mentor encouraged me to take my work and to publish it into a book, and insisted that I shop my book proposal with NYU Press. And so that's how I started with NYU Press. It was the one and only press that I pitched a book to. So they published my first book called Beyond Deportation, and it's a history of prosecutorial discretion in immigration cases. And so when I was in the throes of the Trump administration, and also working on the ground very close to the policy changes, not just as an academic, but also as an attorney and as a teacher, it was insisted upon me that I should once again shop a book proposal with NYU Press, and they were really excited about the book. They decided to make it a trade book. One piece of advice I'd give is, at first I knew nothing about writing a book. I was not ever going into the profession looking to write a book. I think if you do write more than one book, one nice thing about writing for the same press is that you're a repeat author, so they have a certain amount of trust in you. And so I think that can be a really good thing. Having a mentor is also important. So having a mentor who is a prolific author, who is deeply invested in your success, again, because of that shared humanity and because of all the different acts of kindness that surround some of us, I think that is also something to keep in mind.
Do you want to shout out your mentor?
So my mentor for both of my books was Michael Olivas, and he was a law professor, a longtime law professor at the University of Houston, and he writes and publishes at the intersection of higher education and immigration.
So for folks who haven't got the book yet, who haven't hit pause during this interview and went out and bought it, and they're going to hit pause right now and go out and get it, where should they do that?
So one-stop shopping for ordering the book, and also for just a lot of my research and commentary in this arena, is my website, which the URL is beyonddeportation.com. So it's 2 Ds, beyonddeportation.com. Or you can go the trade route through Amazon. And so Band and Wadhia, I think those 2 words alone will probably take you to the page. And you can find both of the books on there.
And for folks on the go, where you can find all of those links that were just mentioned, show notes today are tomriddle.com/Shoba, tomriddle.com/SHOBA, tomriddle.com/Shoba. One question that I ask everybody during my year of adventure is, what is an adventure in your life that you are looking forward to, or you have an intention on exploring?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I have done a lot. If we were to look at adventure as going outside one's comfort zone, I feel like the last 2 years have been an adventure for me, in terms of not just dealing with very little life-work balance, but also lawyering in the fire. So some people might consider that to be an adventure. There is so much more unpredictability in my professional life that I don't have control over because of the field that I'm in, because of the way policies are being issued and enacted, and because of my deep desire and calling to help the people I am able to, and also educate the public at the same time, and grow the next generation of immigration lawyers. If I were to define adventure as something more fun or personal, then I have a very long list of things that I'd love to do, and they may be quite boring for others, because I have the bucket list of places I haven't been to, like the national parks. We did make it to the Valley Forge National Park, which is not too far away from me, but now we want to cover them all at some point. I'd also love to spend some time with my family abroad, studying and teaching for a semester or a year somewhere else. And so maybe that's a long-term adventure that I see in the future.
I love that. I need to practice discipline and stopping to ask questions. So I promise these are my last 2. But you brought something up that I have to ask, because I know a lot of people struggle with this uncertainty and having things outside of your control. So you mentioned that there's a lot of things that are outside of your control in your professional life. Do you have any mindset practices or rituals or any advice to people on, if they're resonating with that as well?
Well, I would love to hear your audience members' mindset practices. If they have any, that they will certainly be helpful to me. I don't know that I have the best ones. I still wake up in the morning, so I still try and do some of the hardest things that I do have control over early in the morning. Interestingly, having a family is in fact a good mindset, because I still need to worry about, not leaving my daughter out in the dark if I have to go pick her up from music practice, and showing up at every recital to the extent that I'm able. One strange thing that gives me mindset is I find myself in an enormous place of privilege. There are so many people I talk to that feel lost, that feel like what can they do? That's a very common question that I get. What can we do? What can I do? What can a non-immigration lawyer do? And the fact that I happen to have accidentally fallen to immigration law and know the statute a little well, and be familiar enough with it that I can cite you passages, that I can understand when I read an executive order, the extent to which there is legitimacy or concern with a law that is being used to promote the latest new policy. I feel like that knowledge is itself a mindset, because I can go back and say, okay, wait a minute. What is the statute being used here? Do I consider that to be legitimate? How am I going to explain this to the American public? And so I have that as a foundation and as a springboard for where I'm going to go next. That's a really mechanical response to a question about mindset, but it is also a mechanical response that is a constant.
I love that. And for folks who want to take you up on that offer to send you any suggestions, do you have any social media you're on or anything, any way they can contact you?
Sure. I have a Twitter handle, which is at Shoba Wadhia. And there's also a way to contact me at my website link, beyonddeportation.com.
Wonderful. I want to thank you so much for, first of all, taking the leap of faith of answering my email from a stranger and agreeing to this interview, and all of the time and energy and countless hours that you put into writing this book and then sharing it with us. I just want to share my appreciation so much for all that you're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Our closing ritual is for you to share an invitation with those who are listening. So what would be your invitation for them to consider, to think about, to do, to evolve into, to become? What is your invitation?
So my invitation to people is to look at, every person listening to this might be at a different place or on a different spectrum. But if you are in a place of privilege, can you think about what is one thing that I can do to help level the playing field?
I love that.
I'm going to end it there.
What did you say?
I'm going to end it there.
Okay, perfect. I love that so much. And thank you once again for joining us and for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
And to all of those listening, as always, we're wishing you peace and blessings. Thank you. One more thing. I'd love to continue the conversation. Feel free to join me at tomearl.com/join. Subscribe below, or let's connect on social media. Tom Earl Artist. Thanks again for watching.